Gallipoli, the campaign that broke an empire. Before dawn on April 25, 1915, the sea off the Gallipoli Peninsula shimmered like polished glass. The moon was low, and the faint outline of the Turkish coast lay ahead: dark cliffs, silent hills, and the promise of blood. From the decks of Allied transport ships, thousands of soldiers stared toward the faint horizon, their rifles resting across their knees, their breath clouding in the chill air. They were Australians and New Zealanders, part of a force that had sailed halfway across the world to fight for an empire many barely understood. The plan was simple on paper: storm the beaches, capture the heights, and open the Dardanelles Strait to the Royal Navy. In London, it had sounded like strategy. Here, it felt like suicide. The first boats drifted toward land, their oars muffled with cloth to keep silence. Water slapped softly against the wooden hulls. The men inside clutched their gear, hearts pounding under khaki tunics. Some whispered prayers, others gripped photographs tucked inside their breast pockets. Then came the first flicker of muzzle flash from the cliffs. A burst of gunfire ripped through the calm, cutting the silence to shreds. Bullets hissed across the water like angry insects. Men fell before even reaching the shore. Those who survived plunged into the surf, their packs dragging them down as they struggled toward the beach. Dawn broke, not with sunlight, but with screams. When the Australians and New Zealanders finally scrambled onto the narrow strip of sand that would become known as Anzac Cove, chaos reigned. The landing had gone wrong from the start. Strong currents had pushed the boats north of their intended target, straight into a natural fortress. The Turks, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, later known as Atatürk, held the high ground. From ridges overlooking the sea, they poured rifle and machine gun fire into the clustered soldiers below. The cliffs rose almost sheer, offering no shelter, only shadows. Officers tried to rally their men, but commands were swallowed by the din. The sea turned red in the shallows. It was barely 6 a.m. By midday, the beach was a graveyard of ambition. Wounded men lay in heaps, calling for stretcher bearers who would never come. Boats burned offshore, struck by artillery from hidden batteries. Still, small groups of soldiers pushed upward, clawing through thorn bushes and loose rock, fighting inch by inch against an enemy they could rarely see. Every hill seemed to end in another ambush, every advance swallowed by terrain. Gallipoli's ridges and gullies, beautiful from a distance, became labyrinths of death. The men had been promised a swift victory, a heroic charge that would change the course of the war. Instead, they found themselves trapped between the sea behind them and the cliffs ahead, pinned down on a strip of earth no wider than a city street. All along the shore, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite. Officers waded through the shallows, shouting for reinforcements, their voices drowned by the crash of artillery. The landing had devolved into a nightmare of confusion. Units were scattered, maps useless, and the chain of command in shambles. Yet amid the chaos, the young soldiers of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, refused to retreat. They dug shallow trenches in the sand, using their helmets as shovels, forming a crude defensive line against the cliffs. Machine gun bullets tore through the thin walls, spraying sand like rain. The wounded crawled into the surf to cool their burns, only to be swept away by the tide. Gallipoli, meant to be a triumph of strategy, had become a massacre before breakfast. Far above them, the defenders of the Ottoman Empire fought with the desperation of men protecting their homeland. Mustafa Kemal's orders were simple and merciless. "I do not order you to fight, I order you to die." His troops obeyed. Waves of Turkish infantry surged down the slopes, bayonets glinting in the sunlight, their cries of "Allahu Akbar" echoing through the ridges. The Anzacs met them with rifle fire, each volley cutting down attackers who seemed to multiply with every charge. The heat rose, the air shimmered, and the cries of the wounded carried across the gullies. By nightfall, the beaches were littered with corpses from both sides, tangled together in the sand. Neither army had won anything except exhaustion. The British landings at Cape Helles, just miles to the south, fared no better. There, The beaches ran red under Turkish fire as battalions from England, Ireland, and India were slaughtered before even forming ranks. Boats drifted aimlessly, their crews dead or dying. The cliffs erupted in flame as Ottoman artillery zeroed in. Officers waded ashore waist-deep in blood and seawater, rallying survivors amid wrecked landing craft. It was not war, one British lieutenant later wrote, but murder on the open sea. By the second day, command realized the campaign had gone horribly wrong. But instead of retreating, they dug in, determined to hold their foothold, no matter the cost. The peninsula became a trap. As trenches were carved into the hillsides, Gallipoli began to resemble the Western Front, only steeper and crueler. The heat of summer baked the dead where they fell. The stench of decay mixed with the buzz of flies so thick that soldiers covered their faces with rags just to eat. Water was scarce, disease rampant, and the enemy always close enough to hear. Sometimes, at night, the firing would cease, and the two sides would call out to each other, trading insults or songs through the darkness. For a few fleeting moments, humanity peeked through the horror only to vanish with the dawn's first gunfire. By May, the Gallipoli Campaign had settled into a brutal stalemate. The beaches that once shimmered under the Aegean sun were now charnel grounds lined with endless rows of shallow graves. Every assault up the ridges ended in slaughter. The terrain itself conspired against the Allies' narrow ravines, sheer cliffs, and gullies so twisted that men got lost within shouting distance of their own trenches. Flies swarmed over unburied bodies, feeding on rot, laying eggs in open wounds. Food spoiled within hours. Water had to be hauled up from the sea and was often contaminated with corpses. Soldiers grew gaunt, their skin cracked from salt and sun. Yet still, orders came from London and Cairo. Attack again. To retreat would be to admit that the empire's great gamble had failed. On the Turkish side, the cost was no less staggering. The defenders fought barefoot, short on ammunition and supplies, but their resolve only hardened. Mustafa Kemal, commanding from the hills, became a legend among his men. He seemed everywhere at once, calm, composed, his words a lifeline in the chaos. "Those who go forward may die," he told his soldiers, "but those who go back will die anyway." The Ottoman Empire, though crumbling in Europe and the Middle East, found new pride in defending its soil. Every failed Allied assault, every abandoned ridge, strengthened the myth of Turkish endurance. The defenders who had been expected to collapse under modern firepower now stood as unbreakable guardians of their homeland. Throughout the summer, new offensives were launched with mechanical predictability and the same catastrophic results. At Lone Pine, the Anzacs captured Turkish trenches in a furious hand-to-hand battle, bayonets and fists colliding in the dark. For days, the narrow tunnels filled with smoke, blood, and bodies piled 3 deep. The fighting was so close that soldiers could feel the breath of the enemy before they struck. "It was like killing in a coffin," one survivor wrote. Yet even victories at Gallipoli brought no progress, only more names for the lists of the dead. The peninsula, once meant to open the way to Constantinople, had become a tomb. Disease soon did what bullets could not. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid swept through the trenches, carried by contaminated water and flies. Men weakened by heat collapsed from exhaustion. The medical tents overflowed, and surgeons operated without morphine, their scalpels black with rot. Rats grew fat on the corpses that lined the gullies. Letters home were filled with despairing humor. "If the Turks don't kill us," one soldier wrote, "the smell surely will." Commanders on both sides fought not only the enemy but the land itself, a land that seemed determined to swallow every man who set foot on it. Gallipoli had become the graveyard of optimism. By late June, the beaches of Gallipoli were unrecognizable, a wasteland of shattered boats, rusting rifles, and sun-bleached bones half buried in sand. The Allied command, desperate to break the stalemate, planned yet another grand assault. This time, they would strike at multiple points along the peninsula, hoping sheer force could succeed where precision had failed. The men knew better. They had seen what the terrain did to ambition, how the cliffs swallowed battalions like the sea swallows foam. Still, they obeyed. Orders were orders. On August 6, 1915, under the blazing Anatolian sun, the assault began. Naval guns thundered, shaking the sea. The hills answered with machine gun fire. And once again, thousands of soldiers climbed from their trenches and into death's open mouth. The Australians attacked at Lone Pine while the New Zealanders struck north at Chinook Bear. Both names would soon be etched into legend for the blood spilled there. The ridges were so steep that men had to crawl on hands and knees, clutching dry soil that crumbled beneath their fingers. Turkish snipers waited above, hidden in the rocks, their shots echoing like hammer blows. The Anzacs fought yard by yard, using bayonets, fists, and shovels. Many never made it halfway. Those who did found themselves face to face with Kemal's seasoned troops, men who had been fighting, without rest, for 4 relentless months. The ground was alive with bullets, a New Zealander recalled. It was as if the hills themselves spat fire. For 2 days, the battle raged with a fury that stunned even veterans. The air grew thick with dust and gunpowder. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Men fought in trenches barely wide enough for 2, stabbing and clubbing in blind desperation. At night, the wounded moaned for water while stretcher bearers slipped in the dark, tripping over the dead. The living and the dead shared the same narrow burrows, their bodies pressed together in suffocating heat. When dawn broke on August 8th, the heights of Chinook Bear were littered with corpses, so many that movement became impossible without stepping on them. The New Zealanders had taken the summit briefly, raising their flag in triumph. By sunset, a Turkish counterattack swept it away in blood. Further south, at Suvla Bay, the British attempted another landing, an echo of April's disaster. Poor navigation, broken communication, and incompetent leadership doomed the operation before it began. Troops waded ashore unopposed, only to spend critical hours waiting for orders that never came. By the time they advanced inland, the Turks had reinforced the ridges. The British commander, General Stopford, remained aboard his ship, sipping tea as his men died on the beaches. Within days, Suvla joined Anzac Cove as another killing ground. The men who survived joked bitterly that Gallipoli was no longer a place, but a sentence, a punishment handed down by fate to all who served there. By September, Gallipoli had become a furnace of despair. The summer heat turned corpses into blackened husks within hours. The stench drifted for miles, clinging to uniforms, water, and even dreams. Flies covered every surface. Soldiers ate with one hand while swatting with the other. The men's skin peeled from sunburn, their lips cracked, and their uniforms stiffened with salt and blood. The campaign that was supposed to end in weeks had stretched into months, and the men now knew it would end only in death or withdrawal. Yet London still spoke of victory. In dispatches sent to the newspapers, the words were optimistic: progress, courage, initiative. None mentioned that entire battalions had vanished into the scrub without leaving a trace. For the men in the trenches, Gallipoli was less a campaign than a slow decay. Every morning began with the same ritual: wake, swat flies, scrape lice from seams, and pray the rations had not spoiled. The nights were worse. The hills came alive with whispers, rifle fire, and the hum of artillery that never truly ceased. The Turks bombarded by moonlight, the shells glowing faintly as they arced through the sky before bursting in yellow flame. Each explosion illuminated faces, slick with sweat and fear. The men wrote letters they knew would never be mailed, stuffing them into helmets or boots for someone else to find. "If I die," one Australian wrote, "tell mother I died tired." It was a sentiment shared by tens of thousands. On the Turkish side, life was equally brutal. Ammunition was scarce, food scarce, water precious. Men fainted at their posts, their bodies skeletal beneath tattered uniforms, yet morale held. They were defending their home, their soil, their ancestors' graves. Every victory, no matter how small, felt sacred. Mustafa Kemal moved through the trenches like a phantom, calm and unyielding. His men called him Pasha of Iron, and stories spread that bullets could not touch him. He was wounded once by shrapnel, saved only by a pocket watch that deflected the blow. The soldiers believed it was destiny that God himself had chosen Kemal to save the Ottoman land from invaders. To the Allies, he became a symbol of the campaign's futility, an immovable force guarding an impossible shore. Back in Britain, the architects of the operation, Winston Churchill, among them, faced mounting criticism. What had begun as his daring vision to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war had become a political disaster. The Dardanelles campaign had promised to open a route to Russia, to end the stalemate in France, to change the course of the war. Instead, it delivered months of failure and the loss of nearly 500,000 men on both sides. The casualty lists grew longer with every telegram, and mothers who once spoke of honor now cursed the sea that had taken their sons. By autumn, even Churchill admitted what the soldiers had known from the start: Gallipoli was doomed. By October, the campaign had become little more than endurance for endurance's sake. The officers spoke of fresh offensives, but the men no longer believed them. The trenches were shallow, the dugouts collapsing, and the once white sandbags now black with mold. Lice infested every seam of clothing, and dysentery turned the trenches into open sewers. The smell of rot clung to everything: food, blankets, even the sea breeze. At night, the soldiers lay awake listening to the waves and the soft coughing of the sick, wondering if they would live to see another sunrise. When the wind changed, they could hear the Turks singing prayers from their lines. The sound was haunting, almost peaceful, and more than one Allied soldier whispered that their enemies sounded closer to God than their generals ever would. Small truces occurred between bursts of battle. Sometimes a shout in broken English, "You no shoot, we no shoot," would echo across the gullies, and for a few hours, both sides lowered their rifles. Soldiers would crawl out to collect their dead, exchange cigarettes, or share water in silence before vanishing back into their trenches. For a moment, they were simply men again, not enemies. But the illusion never lasted. As soon as night fell or a new order arrived, the shooting began anew. Gallipoli's cruelty lay not only in its violence, but in its futility. Every yard of land gained by one side was lost again by the other. Nothing changed but the number of crosses dotting the ridges. By November, the rains came. The dry dust turned into rivers of mud, sweeping through the trenches like liquid earth. Rifles jammed, boots sank, and tents collapsed under the weight of water. Floods drowned the wounded in their sleep. Then came the frost, turning mud into stone and fingers into claws. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets. The soldiers burned whatever they could find: wood, rations, even furniture to keep warm. The water froze inside canteens, and the dead stiffened where they fell. Medical stations filled with men shaking uncontrollably, their feet blackened with gangrene. The campaign had reached the point where nature itself joined the Turks in defense. The peninsula no longer needed bullets to kill. In London, the debate over evacuation finally broke open. The generals hesitated, fearing that retreat under fire would become another disaster like the landings. But logistics and morale had reached collapse. Ships were ordered back to ferry survivors home. The men on the ground heard whispers of it weeks before the orders came. They didn't celebrate. Most were too numb to feel relief. The withdrawal was conducted in eerie silence, boots muffled, mules padded, rifles fixed in place to fire automatically after the last men left. By mid-December, the beaches were empty. The evacuation of Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay was completed without a single casualty. It was the first and only success of the Gallipoli Campaign. When the last boat slipped away from the shore in the cold darkness of December 20th, 1915, Gallipoli was finally silent. The waves lapped against the sand where thousands had fallen, and the hills above, once alive with gunfire, stood ghostly and still. The Turks watched from their trenches, astonished. For months, they had prepared for a final Allied assault, unaware that the enemy had already vanished beneath the moonlit horizon. On the beaches, the British had left behind dummies in helmets and rifles rigged with water-timed triggers to fire after their departure, creating the illusion of men still standing guard. When the last rifle cracked in the night and then fell silent, the campaign that had begun with thunder ended with a whisper. The cost was staggering. Of the roughly 500,000 Allied troops who fought on the peninsula, over 200,000 were killed or wounded. The Ottomans suffered nearly as many. Disease claimed more lives than bullets. Entire villages in Australia and New Zealand lost their sons, while Turkish families grieved in equal measure. The survivors carried scars that never healed, both on their bodies and in their memories. One Australian wrote after returning home, "We left more than men behind on that beach. We left our belief in glory." Gallipoli had promised triumph but delivered only disillusionment. It was the moment when a generation learned that courage could not conquer incompetence, and faith could not overcome fate. For the British Empire, Gallipoli was a humiliation that would haunt its leadership for decades. Winston Churchill, the campaign's architect, resigned in disgrace, spending months in political exile before returning to the front as an officer in France. The failure of the Dardanelles shattered the illusion of British invincibility and exposed the flaws of imperial command, a distant bureaucracy making fatal decisions from comfortable rooms. For the soldiers of the Dominions, the campaign changed everything. Australians and New Zealanders, once proud to fight under the Union Jack, began to see themselves as nations distinct from Britain. The Anzac legend was born not from victory, but from endurance, the quiet heroism of men who fought, bled, and died together on foreign soil. In Turkey, the campaign became a story of national resurrection. Mustafa Kemal emerged from Gallipoli as the defender of the homeland, a hero who would later lead his people through revolution and become Atatürk, founder of modern Turkey. For the Ottoman Empire, still reeling from decline, Gallipoli was proof that it could resist the greatest powers on earth. The battle became sacred in Turkish memory, a testament to unity, sacrifice, and the will to survive. Even today, the hills above Anzac Cove are lined with memorials in both languages, inscribed with Atatürk's message to the mothers of fallen Allied soldiers. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. In the years after the war, Gallipoli became both a wound and a shrine. Pilgrims began to visit the peninsula, Australians and New Zealanders, traveling across oceans to stand where their ancestors had fallen. They came not seeking triumph, but understanding. The ridges and gullies that once echoed with gunfire now stood quiet under the wind, the ground still littered with rusted bullets and fragments of shrapnel. Locals called it the silent battlefield. Wildflowers grew among the bones, and the Aegean shimmered as if unaware of the pain beneath its surface. Veterans who returned often spoke in whispers, reluctant to recall the horror. Yet when they did, they described not hatred for their foes, but respect. The Turks, too, had fought with bravery, with dignity, and with the same fear in their eyes. Each April 25th, the anniversary of the landings, dawn services began on the shores of Anzac Cove. As the first light touched the water, bugles sounded and names were read aloud, young men from farms, factories, and small towns across two hemispheres. Silence followed, broken only by the waves. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became more than a battle. It was a birth. Out of failure came identity, out of tragedy, nationhood. The Anzac spirit, courage, mateship, endurance, and sacrifice became the cornerstone of their collective memory. For the Turks, the same ground symbolized something just as sacred: unity and survival against overwhelming odds. Thus, the enemies of 1915 became the shared mourners of its memory. The site remains one of the few places in the world where former adversaries are commemorated side by side. The cemeteries, maintained with immaculate care, bear inscriptions in English, Turkish, French, and Arabic. Each headstone tells the same quiet story of youth interrupted, of orders followed, of lives cut short by ambitions they did not choose. The soil holds no distinction between conqueror and conquered. Over time, the name Gallipoli ceased to mean defeat or victory. It came to mean endurance itself, a testament to the futility of war and the resilience of the human spirit. Those who walk its beaches today speak of a strange peace, a feeling that the land has forgiven what men could not. Yet the lesson of Gallipoli is not merely sorrow, it is warning. It shows what happens when arrogance replaces strategy, when politics outweighs humanity, when men in distant offices gamble with lives they'll never meet. The Dardanelles campaign was born from ambition, but buried by hubris. It broke empires, remade nations, and revealed the terrible cost of pride. In that way, Gallipoli was not simply a tragedy of 1915, it was a prophecy for the century to come. The cliffs still stand, scarred but unbroken, overlooking a sea that remembers everything. And every April, when dawn breaks over Anzac Cove, the wind seems to whisper the same refrain, lest we forget. A century has passed, yet Gallipoli still breathes through the silence of its cliffs. The gulls wheel above the same turquoise waters where soldiers once drowned beneath their packs, and the wind carries the faint scent of salt and memory. At dawn, when the sun climbs over the Dardanelles, the peninsula glows golden, serene, almost sacred. Tourists walk the old trenches, tracing the lines carved by hands that shook with exhaustion. They pause at the ridges where men once fought over a few meters of dust and rock, and they listen. Some say you can still hear the echo of waves mingled with distant voices, the laughter, the orders, the cries. But the land no longer belongs to war. It belongs to remembrance. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became the forge of identity, the moment they stepped from the shadow of empire and discovered themselves as nations. For Turkey, it became the cornerstone of rebirth, the proof that unity could overcome collapse. And for Britain, it was the lesson of humility learned at too great a price. The campaign's failure reshaped strategy, politics, and perception, showing that courage could not redeem poor leadership. Each side carried away something different from that narrow, sunburned shore, yet all shared the same understanding. Gallipoli was not a battlefield. It was a mirror reflecting humanity at its most courageous and its most blind. In the cemeteries above Anzac Cove, the names carved in stone remain young forever. They are 20, 21, 19 ages frozen in eternity, guarded by the sea's unending rhythm. The poppies that bloom among the graves bend with the wind, their red petals bright against the pale earth. They are the only color in a landscape shaped by sorrow. Visitors kneel before the stones, reading the inscriptions left by parents long gone. He sleeps far from home, but close to our hearts. Some cry softly, others simply stand and watch the horizon, imagining the sound of those first boats approaching through the dawn mist. Gallipoli endures not because it was a victory, but because it was a truth. It showed the world that bravery and tragedy can be inseparable, that nations are built not only on triumphs, but on the pain of learning what war truly costs. The campaign broke empires, but it also bound former enemies in shared respect. The men who died there left behind more than loss, they left understanding. Today, the waters of the Dardanelles are calm, their surface unbroken, but beneath them lies the memory of an empire's gamble and a generation's sacrifice. And when the sun sets over those quiet ridges, the light turns red, as if the land itself remembers the blood that once made it sacred.